I'm very happy to welcome you tonight on behalf of the Alexandria Historical Society to our second behind the scenes program, which are either offered by Zoom or in-person walks, talks, and gatherings that we do over the course of the year. Our first Zoom, which you can see on YouTube, was about revolutionary women. And now we have a particular woman during the revolution to look at, Martha Washington, somebody very close to Alexandria, obviously, and oftentimes a person that individuals do not know very much about. I want to let everybody know that we are recording tonight and it will be available on YouTube, as are our Lyceum lectures and Zooms. And please put your questions in the chat and keep your microphones off, please. And we'll probably be able to have other opportunities to speak to Mary in the future as well. The first image you saw on the screen was a little known image. Very few people know about it, and is owned by the Ladies Association Mount Vernon. And here are a series of other images that Peggy Harlow was able to put up from the Library of Congress. This is often how you see her in reenactments versus the image of what appears to be a younger woman in the other portrait. So if we could now turn to introducing Mary. I'm very happy to welcome Mary Thompson tonight because of all of the historians and people doing research in the local area, I think I envy Mary more than almost anyone and also admire her greatly. Mary is currently the research historian emerita at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and she's also emerita board member for the Alexandria Historical Society. This is how Mary describes herself. It's not me. Mary was raised as an Army brat on military posts across the United States in a number of places, from Missouri, New York, Maryland, and her family had 2 postings in West Germany and the occupied city of West Berlin. She also worked as a volunteer at 2 U.S. Army museums and as a field researcher sponsored by a age grant to a practitioner of traditional folk crafts in Central Alabama. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in history and a minor in folklore from Samford University in Birmingham, and a master's degree in history from UVA, where her thesis dealt with the relationship between colonists and Native Americans in Georgia and the Carolinas in the 18th century. Well, it's pretty interesting. Not so bad in order to get a job at Mount Vernon. And starting there in 1980, Mary has enjoyed, and we've had the privilege of her research and writing experience for 44 years there, starting out as a curatorial assistant and eventually becoming research historian from 2008 to 2024. She did much of the research to programs in all the department of Vernon, with a primary focus on day life on the estate. This would be domestic routines, foodways, religious practices, slavery, and the enslaved community itself. She's lectured on a variety of these topics. She's also authored 3 books that I hope you will be able to read at some point. In Hands of God, Province of Religion in the Life of George Washington, that was published by you in 2008. And she received the Alexandria Award from our society at that time. The only object of regret, George Washington's Slavery and the Enslaved Community of Mount Vernon, also published by UVA Press in 2019, and won the James C. Bradford Prize for biography from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. She's also done a short biography of Martha Washington put out by Benna Books, which is an imprint of Applewood Books in 2017. She's also provided a variety of chapters and lectures. I'd also like to be able to say that I think it's absolutely amazing and exciting that over the time Mary has been at Mount Vernon, she has cataloged virtually all of the primary correspondence as well as contextual information from others about George Washington, as well as Mary Washington. I suppose there might be a letter or something that comes across now that's new for her, but how amazing that she can write books about George Washington and talk about Mary Washington and do some new books on hopefully Mary, but also on the animals associated with Mount Vernon. So, well, let's hear from Mary today about Martha Washington. Do you want to start?
Okay. Good evening. I'm glad you're here. Um, so I will get started talking. Um, for years, Mount Vernon has told visitors during their tours of the mansion that Martha Washington spent every winter of the Revolution with her husband at his military headquarters. Often the trunk her eldest granddaughter, Eliza Park Custis Law, identified as the one her grandmother used while traveling to and from camp in the war, was pointed out to them, along with Eliza Law's note detailing her sadness when, as a small child, she watched her grandmother packing each fall, but also her joy the following spring when her beloved grandmama would unpack this same trunk filled with toys and other good things um, for the youngest members of her family. Visitors would seem interested, but I'm not sure that they or even we really understood the impact of the statement. Martha Washington spent every winter of the Revolution with her husband at his military headquarters. That changed in 2002 when we began the commemoration of the 200th anniversary of Martha Washington's death, and suddenly realized that very little scholarly research had been done on her. That year, I looked into many aspects of her life, but spent most of my time concentrating on her experiences during the war. What really doesn't strike home with the words Martha Washington spent every winter of the Revolution with her husband at his military headquarters is the impact of this travel and these events on her life. Now, when a person can, in theory, maybe not today, drive from Mount Vernon to Boston in 8 hours or less, or even fly there in an hour, there's no appreciation of the physical punishment of several weeks to a month of travel one way in order to go the same distance. Military headquarters suggest parties and interactions with other officers and their wives, but seems relatively comfortable without any hint of threat to personal safety. Spending the winter sounds as though Martha was in camp for maybe 3 months at the most each year. In actuality, while she was with her husband for only 2 to 3 months in the second year of the war, there were some years when the Washingtons were together more than they were apart. For example, 8 to 9 months in the first year, 4 months in the third, 6 months in both the fourth and sixth years, 7 months in the fifth, 8 months in the seventh, and 11 months in the last year of the war. In total, Martha Washington spent 52 to 54 of the roughly 103 months of the war, or almost half the time, either with her husband in camp or nearby in the hope that they would spend more time together. The buildup to war began over a period of about a dozen years, from the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 to the spring of 1775 when fighting broke out in the towns of Lexington and Concord near Boston. Martha Washington, while preoccupied with raising children during much of this time, would have been aware of the growing discontent with British colonial policy because of her husband's connection to the House of Burgesses and conversations with family, friends, and neighbors throughout Virginia. In September 1774, George Washington and two other Virginia delegates left from Mount Vernon to attend the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, where representatives from each of the colonies could discuss the deteriorating political situation and determine the best way to respond to it. As he, Patrick Henry, and Edmund Pendleton prepared to set off, Martha Washington made clear her loyalty to the American cause, inspiring this verbal portrait of her by Pendleton as her world began to change. I was much pleased with Mrs. Washington and her spirit, She seemed ready to make any sacrifice and was cheerful, though I knew she felt anxious. She talked like a Spartan mother to her son on going to battle. I hope you will stand firm. I know George will, she said. As the gentlemen left, she stood in the door and cheered us with the good words, God be with you, gentlemen. Martha Washington would remain loyal to the Revolution, but a large part of her faithfulness to the cause derived from the strength of her attachment to her husband. This comes through most strongly when the illnesses and deaths of family members pulled her in several directions. Shortly before Christmas of 1777, for example, she learned that her favorite sister had died. She wrote from Mount Vernon to assure her newly widowed brother-in-law that nothing in this world do I wish for more sincerely than to be with you. But alas, I am so situated at this time that I cannot leave home. The general has wrote to me that he cannot come home this winter, but as soon as the army under his command goes into winter quarters, he will send for me. If he does, I must go. A letter written the following year shows just how contrary to her own wishes all this travel actually was. Upon learning of the severe illness of her mother, she remarked wistfully to one of her brothers, I wish I was near enough to come to see you and her. I'm very uneasy at this time. Her mother lived in the southern part of the state. I have some reason to expect that I shall take another trip northward. The poor general is not likely to come see us from what I can hear. I expect to hear certainly by the next post if I am so happy as to stay at home. Throughout the Revolution, clues to where did it go? Throughout the Revolution, clues to the Washingtons' relationship pop up in many different places. George Washington's worries about his wife come across strongly in a series of letters he sent to relatives shortly after his appointment as commander of the Continental Army in the summer of 1775. 17 years earlier, according to an Englishman who knew the Washingtons prior to the Revolution, George Washington had left his military career for life on a plantation and a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses because of the entreaties of his wife-to-be, the 26-year-old widowed mother of two named Martha Dandridge Custis. Now, as he was telling his stepson Jack about his new responsibilities, Washington confided that my great concern upon this occasion is the thought of leaving your mother under the uneasiness which I fear this affair will throw her into. I therefore hope, expect, and indeed have no doubt of your using every means in your power to keep up her spirits by doing everything in your power to promote her quiet. He told Jack that he and his bride, Nellie, were always welcome to stay at Mount Vernon, especially at this juncture, when I think it absolutely necessary for the peace and satisfaction of your mother. It wasn't just the immediate family who were asked to help Martha Washington get over the shock and loneliness of her husband's absence, but relatives and even friends from quite some distance away were also recruited for the task. Another way George Washington helped his wife deal with their forced separation was to invite her to his winter camps. Several of the people who saw the Washingtons together during the war recorded their delight at being reunited. The year 1770 was the one in which they were able to spend the least amount of time together of any in the war. Following Washington's victories at the end of 1776 and the beginning of 1777, his army made its way to winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey, for the remainder of the season. Martha Washington left Mount Vernon in March, spending a few days in Philadelphia, before traveling on to her husband's headquarters. One officer, Nathaniel Greene, commented to his wife that Mrs. Washington and Mrs. Bland, who was another officer's wife, from Virginia are at camp, happy in their better halves. Mrs. Washington is excessive fond of the general and he of her. They are very happy in each other. The aforementioned Mrs. Bland then sent her sister-in-law a long description of how the Washingtons spent their days in camp that year, noting that George Washington's quote, worthy lady seems to be in perfect felicity while she is by the side of her old man, as she calls him. We often make parties on horseback. George Washington's cheerfulness at the presence of his wife was noted as well, for Mrs. Bland wrote that during these riding parties, General Washington throws off the hero and takes on the chatty, agreeable companion. He can be downright impudent sometimes, such impudence, Fanny, as you and I like. These descriptions were echoed the following year as the Continental Army struggled to survive at Valley Forge. In January 1778, the Marquis de Lafayette wrote his young wife, who was far away in France, about the presence of other officers' wives in camp. Several general officers have brought their wives to camp, and I'm very envious of the pleasure they have in being able to see them. General Washington has also just decided to send for his wife, a modest, respectable person who loves her husband madly. In traveling to meet her husband for each of the 8 years of the war, Martha Washington had to overcome a number of obstacles, including fears for her own safety. Especially in the summer and fall of 1775, there was some concern that she, as the wife of the commanding general of the Continental Army, might be targeted by the British. During these months, her safety was the subject of much of the surviving correspondence between George Washington and his cousin Lund, who was managing Mount Vernon in his absence. The general wrote in late August that he could hardly think that Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia, can act so low, so unmanly a part as to think of seizing Mrs. Washington by way of revenge upon me. He was comforted that for the next couple of months she would be away from home, visiting friends and relatives elsewhere in Virginia, and so would be out of Dunmore's reach for 2 or 3 months to come, after which he hoped events would play out in such a way as to render her removal either absolutely necessary or quite useless. He thanked some unnamed gentlemen of Alexandria for their friendly attention on this point, and added that the one believed there was any sort of reason to suspect that she was in danger, to provide a kitchen for her in Alexandria or some other place of safety elsewhere for her and my papers. Concerns that Martha might be a target of the British continued throughout the war. In the late spring of 1780, military action began again after that winter hiatus with a British push into New Jersey. George Washington and his staff had been gone from his winter headquarters at Morristown for several days in early June, when a young officer assigned to guard Martha left an interesting description of the commanding general's wife. I am at present enjoying myself incomparably well in the family of Mrs. Washington, whose guard I have had the honor to command since the absence of the general, which is now 6 or 7 days. I am happy in the importance of my charge, as well as in the presence of the most amiable woman upon earth, whose character, should I attempt to describe, I could not do justice to. The first and second nights after I came, it was expected that a body of the enemy's horse would pay us a visit, but I was well prepared to receive them. And I think every time when you're a 40-something woman and or older, and you've got some young officer telling you that, calling you the most amiable woman upon earth, you're doing all right. Martha also faced physical harm from enemy bombardment. During the first winter of the conflict, she wrote to a friend in Alexandria about her concern for the citizens of Boston and Charlestown and how shaken she was at hearing British guns. Some days we have a number of cannon and shells from Boston and Bunker's Hill, but it does not seem to surprise anyone but me. I confess I shudder every time I hear the sound of a gun. I just took a look at Port Boston and Charlestown from Prospect Hill. Charlestown has only a few chimneys standing in it. There seems to be a number of very fine buildings in Boston, but God knows how long they will stand. They are pulling up all the wharfs for firewood. To me, that never see anything of war, the preparations are very terrible indeed, but I endeavor to keep my fears to myself as well as I can. Not just capture and wayward artillery, but illness as well threatened Martha's safety during the war. The American military camps brought together men from different parts of the country, from relatively isolated farms and small communities into crowded conditions, where they came into contact with disease-causing agents from other areas to which they had no immunity. As their resistance Stressed to the breaking point from various factors, being away from home, inadequate food, lack of proper hygiene, their introduction to military discipline, and understandable fears about being in battle. Disease was rampant. Especially in the early years of the Revolution, one of the biggest challenges to the survival of the American army was smallpox, which remained a threat until George Washington instituted a regular program of quarantine and inoculation to deal with the problem. Martha would have been introduced to these conditions, and especially the danger of smallpox during that first winter in Cambridge, and it was sometime during that initial stay that she made the decision to be inoculated herself, a choice which would have an impact on her future ability to come to headquarters. George Washington wrote from New York at the end of April 1776 to his younger brother, John Augustine, relating the news that his wife was considering inoculation, although he doubted her resolution. In expressing his feeling that his wife might not go through with the procedure, George Washington was undoubtedly thinking back several years to when his stepson was a teenager. Jack Custis's schoolmaster had insisted that the boy be inoculated before making a proposed grand tour to Europe, a trip which never materialized. Inoculation involved scratching a bit of pus from the sores of someone suffering from smallpox into the arm of a person who'd never had the disease, leading to a very mild and less dangerous case and consequent lifelong immunity from this dreaded scourge. Martha Washington had been so anxious about the possibility that young Custis might die as a result of the procedure that at her request she was not told until after he had completely recovered. The fact that 5 years later she was willing to undertake inoculation herself probably says as much about her attachment to her husband as does her willingness to travel such great distances during the war to be with him. In May 1776, despite her husband's doubts, Martha underwent inoculation in Philadelphia. The result was a very mild case of smallpox. George Washington noted in one letter that after 13 days, she had only a very few pustules, and in another mentioned that she had got through the fever and not more than about a dozen pustules appearing. When he learned how successful the procedure had been, her son, Jack Custis, responded with a very telling statement about his parents' relationship. It gave me the sincerest pleasure to hear that my dearest mother had gone through this smallpox so favorably, as she can now attend you to any part of the continent with pleasure, unsullied by the apprehensions of that disorder, and whose presence will alleviate the care and anxiety which public transactions may occasion. This consideration has added much to the pleasure I feel on this occasion, as your happiness when together will be much greater than when you are apart. While there is evidence that Martha sometimes acted as a secretary in her husband's busy office, making copies of letters for his records, her most important role was probably social. During the war, her social circle expanded dramatically as she met influential members of society in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. She also found herself entertaining diplomats of their nations and cultures. In January 1776, John Adams recorded that he had dinner at a home in Cambridge with G. Washington and General Horatio Gates and their ladies. It would prove to be an interesting occasion, primarily because of the other guests that day, 6 Native American leaders and warriors with their wives and children who had come to offer their services to the Americans. Adams found the little group quite interesting, though lacking in table manners. He wrote, "There's a mixture of white blood, French, or English in most of them. Louis, their principal, speaks English and French as well as Indian. It was a savage feast, carnivorous animals devouring their prey." He's not exactly, politically correct. Yet they were wondrous polite. The general introduced me to them as one of the Grand Council Fire at Philadelphia, upon which they made me many bows and a cordial reception. Martha Washington's reaction to this dinner was not recorded. While George Washington had spent considerable time among Native Americans on the frontier, it's not known if this was the first situation which his wife found herself in company with Indian people. But I doubt it, because there were also many times official delegations of Native Americans who would come to Williamsburg to meet with the governor. And Martha's first husband had a family house in Williamsburg, and so there's a good chance she met these delegations when they came to see the governor. It would certainly not, however, be the last time that Martha would see Native American people, including at her own home at Mount Vernon. An oral tradition among the Oneida suggests that Martha Washington presented a shawl, still treasured by the tribe today, to Polly Cooper, an Oneida woman who accompanied a group of their men to Valley Forge, where she helped to feed starving American soldiers. Later, during her husband's presidency, Martha Washington played hostess to tribal delegations at both the Executive Mansion and at Mount Vernon. Don't know why that's doing that. Anyway, it was also during the first winter of the war that Martha became friends with a woman who, though better educated than herself, fell under the spell of the commander-in-chief's wife. Mercy Otis Warren was the sister of the so-called patriot orator James Warren. Noted herself as a writer and historian, Mercy Warren invited Martha Washington to stay at her home if the situation in camp became too unsettled. Various attempts were made to meet over the next few months, and the two women were finally able to get together shortly before Martha Washington left Cambridge, when the more sophisticated woman from Massachusetts found herself completely charmed by this heretofore rather sheltered, middle-aged wife and mother from Virginia. Mrs. Warren later described their meeting to her friend Abigail Adams. "I was received with politeness and respect, with the ease and cordiality of friendship. I will tell you, I think the complacency of her manners speaks at once the benevolence of her heart, and her affability, candor, and gentleness qualify her to soften the hours of private life, or to sweeten the cares of the hero and smooth the rugged scenes of war." On at least one occasion, Martha found herself playing hostess to prominent civilians who found their way to headquarters to request assistance. It was early spring in 1778 when Elizabeth Drinker and 3 other Quaker women from Philadelphia arrived at the Valley Forge headquarters one afternoon, carrying a petition signed by 18 of their fellow believers. Wives, parents, and friends of a group of Quaker men who had been exiled to Virginia because of their refusal to take an oath of loyalty to the Americans. The little delegation, having failed to win permission from Congress to let the men go home, was trying their luck with George Washington. Mrs. Drinker and her party visited with Martha Washington until the general was free to join the conversation. Washington invited these guests to stay for dinner, which they later described as elegant. Other than the guests, Martha Washington was the only woman present at the table with 18 officers. She later took the guests up to her room so that they could visit a little while longer, while her husband and his staff got back to work. The mission of the Quaker women was a partial success. George Washington gave them a pass through the American lines so that they could take their petition to the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, the political body which by that time controlled the fate of their men, who were released at the end of that month. Historian Linda Kerber has suggested that George Washington carefully used the custom of separating the ladies from the gentlemen after dinner in order to limit his dealings with the importunate Quaker women. She makes nothing, however, of Martha's presence, her role in dealing with this women, or any influence she, having spent considerably more time with the women than he, may have had on her husband's decision-making process. When George Washington gave the women permission to pass through the American lines in order to reach the governing body of Pennsylvania, he wrote that humanity pleads strongly in their behalf, a statement which led Kerber to suggest that it may be that the case was given more human resonance through the women's presence. It's also possible that his wife's support for the Quaker women's cause also gave the issue more human resonance in Washington's eyes. Not all of Martha Washington's time at camp was spent with people who were notable for their intellectual abilities or their social prominence, for she also came to know her husband's rank and file soldiers. According to George Washington Parke Custis, his grandmother was very much beloved by the Continental Army and later by its veterans, and her annual visits to camp were much anticipated. Her many intercessions with the chief, meaning George Washington, for the pardon of offenders, and her kindness to the sick and wounded caused her annual arrival in camp to be hailed as an event that would serve to dissipate the gloom of the winter quarters. And I should mention here that this Custis's mention of her kindness to the sick and wounded, I think has led people to think that she was, actually caring for sick soldiers, sick and wounded soldiers. Um, a colleague, Nancy Lowen, who has been on the Valley Forge staff for many, many years, has not been able to find any direct references to Martha actually, physically caring for the soldiers. My guess is she probably would maybe come in and talk or pray with them or something like that. But she was not taking, she was not nursing the soldiers. Custis's words echo those of Dr. James Thatcher, an Army doctor who visited Washington's headquarters at Middlebrook in the first part of 1779. He recorded a dinner at which two young ladies from Virginia were present to keep Martha Washington from being the only woman at the gathering. Mrs. Washington combines in an uncommon degree great dignity of manner with the most pleasing affability. I learned from the Virginia officers that Mrs. Washington has ever been honored as a lady of distinguished goodness, possessing all the virtues which adorn her sex, amiable in her temper and deportment, full of benignity, benevolence, and charity, seeking for objects of affliction and poverty, that she may extend to the sufferers the hand of kindness and relief. Some years after these events, during George Washington's presidency, it was said that old soldiers would often stop by the executive mansion to reminisce about the war with the First Lady, who consistently gave them her time and some sort of refreshment. A little chess set now in the collection at Mount Vernon testifies to one soldier's affection for the wife of his commander. The knights are different from the rest of the set, said to have been carved for Martha Washington by a blind soldier in the Continental Army. It was her concern for the plight of the common soldiers, which probably led to one of the most interesting incidents of the war. The winter of 1779 to 80 was not a happy one, as the countryside around Washington's headquarters at Morristown labored under 4 feet of snow. So it would have been pretty much like this last winter, with drifts reaching as high as 12 feet, making this, meteorologically at least, the worst winter of the war. Supplies were short, and both men and animals suffered terribly. The Army was angry about the lack of support from both Congress and the states, and at one point the entire Connecticut line threatened to leave en masse. Washington wrote that if they had not been persuaded to stay, the rest of the Army might well have gone with them. The anger of the men was mirrored by their officers, and the constant tension sometimes erupted in quarrels and violence during social gatherings in the officers' quarters that winter. Months later, in writing about the situation at Morristown, Martha Washington noted that there was not much pleasure there. The distress of the Army and other difficulties, though I did not know the cause, the poor general was so unhappy that it distressed me exceedingly. In June 1780, following that terrible winter, as she was once again stopping in Philadelphia on her way home, Martha Washington tried to do something about the problems facing the Army. She, along with several other prominent ladies, including Benjamin Franklin's daughter, became involved in a campaign to get American women to provide aid to the Continental Army. The project was spearheaded by Esther de Burt Reed, the young English-born wife of Joseph Reed, a former military secretary, to George Washington, who was then serving as president of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania. Given her husband's position, Esther Reed undoubtedly knew something about the problems which had plagued the army at Morristown. However, it is impossible not to think that Martha Washington was the source, through personal conversation, for enough firsthand examples of suffering and need in camp to spur the other ladies into action. The basic idea, as outlined in the Pennsylvania Gazette, was for one lady to be chosen by the other women in each county to act as a local treasurer, gather in funds, and keep a record of each donation. Once the money was collected, each county treasurer would send both the contributions and the registers to the First Lady of her state, who would in turn send it along to Martha Washington. Because Mrs. Washington might not be in camp when the contributions were sent in, the ladies asked that General Washington receive them on her behalf. At that point, General Washington will dispose of this fund in the manner that he shall judge most advantageous to the soldiery. The American women desire only that it may not be employed to procure to the army the objects of subsistence, arms, or clothing, which are due to them by the continent. It is an extraordinary bounty, intended to render the condition of the soldier more pleasant, and not to hold place of the things which they ought to receive from the Congress or the states. George Washington was quite touched when he learned of the project, and then sent his thoughts about the best way to benefit the soldiers. I very much admire the patriotic spirit of the ladies of Philadelphia. Although the terms of the association seem to preclude the purchase of any article which the public is bound to find, which means they were expected to, the government was expected to furnish these things, I would nevertheless recommend a provision of shirts in preference to anything else, in case the fund should amount to a sum equivalent to a supply of 8 or 10,000. The soldiery are exceedingly in want of them, and the public have never, for several years past, been able to procure a sufficient quantity to make them comfortable. They are, besides, more capable of an equal and satisfactory distribution than almost any other article. Should the fund fall short of a supply of the number of shirts I have mentioned, perhaps there could be no better application of the money than laying it out in the purchase of refreshments for the hospitals. These are my ideas at present. Negotiations between George Washington and Esther Reed continued throughout the summer concerning the best use for the contributions. The women had at first thought that they would give the soldiers, each soldier, individual money in hard silver. And Washington said, no way. They'll gamble it, they'll spend it on something they shouldn't, and then they'll be just in the same bad ditch they were in before. So these negotiations were going on. The campaign expanded beyond Philadelphia. By mid-July, Esther Reed wrote that the ladies in that city had garnered pledges or subscriptions for $200,580 and had in hand an additional sum of over £625, for a total value in paper money of $300,634, or $7,500 in specie. She noted that she had written to the other states in hopes that the ladies there will adopt a similar plan to render it more general and beneficial. Less than 2 weeks later, on behalf of the ladies of New Jersey, a Miss Mary Dagworthy sent in $15,488, which had been subscribed in the city of Trenton alone, promising to send those from the rest of the state without delay as they came in. Further south, Martha Washington suggested the wife of Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson as the logical head of the campaign in their state. Martha Jefferson, and this is interesting because this is the only surviving, as far as I know, is the only letter that survives from her, because Thomas Jefferson had destroyed his and his wife's correspondence after her death. Martha Jefferson followed up with an announcement of the plan in the Virginia Gazette on 9 August 1780, and with at least one personal letter on the subject. Mrs. Washington has done me the honor of communicating the enclosed proposition of our sisters in Pennsylvania and informing me that the same grateful sentiments are displaying themselves in Maryland. Justifying the sanction of her letter in handing forward the scheme, I undertake with cheerfulness the duty of furnishing to my countrywomen an opportunity of proving that they also participate of those virtuous feelings which gave birth to it. I cannot do more for its promotion by enclosing to you some of the papers to be disposed of as you think proper. According to the Virginia newspapers, the collections were to be taken up in the churches, at which sermons suited to the occasion will doubtless be preached by the several ministers of the gospel. Records from Virginia are incomplete, but indicate that Alexandria contributed $75,800 under the lead of Lady Washington, while Fredericksburg, the home of George Washington's mother and sister, sent £1,600 and another $7,506 came from the women of Prince William County, and another £1,560 from Albemarle County. Evidence from one of the Mount Vernon account books indicates that Martha Washington herself donated $20,000, which was equivalent to £6,000, to the campaign in October 1780. Listed as Mrs. Washington's bounty to the soldiers, the money was turned over to a Mrs. Ramsey, who was probably the Alexandria lady in charge of the collection. Contributors to the campaign ranged from the small and unknown to prominent women from other countries, despite or perhaps reflective of complaints from loyalists in Philadelphia that the ladies, who were quite literally knocking on every door, were, quote, so extremely importunate that people were obliged to give them something to get rid of them. More than 1,600 individuals in that city made donations for the soldiers, including a Black woman named Phyllis, who gave 7 shillings and 6 pence, the Countess de Luzerne, who provided $6,000 in paper money, and the wife of the Marquis de Lafayette, who sent 100 guineas in specie. Sadly, the strain of the fundraising effort on Esther Reed's health before she had recovered from giving birth in May proved too much for the young woman and led to her death during a dysentery epidemic in September 1780 at the age of 34. Ultimately, the offering of the ladies was primarily used, as George Washington had suggested, to supply his soldiers with clothing, including shirts and stockings. And there's a wonderful description that I didn't put in here because there wouldn't have been time, but I'll just say quickly that Benjamin Franklin's daughter was visited by one of the French officers while all this is going on. And she had over 2,000 shirts in her at her home, and plus stockings that that the ladies were trying to pack up. In many ways, the Martha Washington of 1783 was a very different woman from the sheltered and rather fearful lady who gave George Washington so much concern as he went off to the Revolution 8 years before. She had faced her fears, traveling to unfamiliar parts of the country, undergoing smallpox inoculation, living in a camp full of soldiers, trying to seem unconcerned as enemy artillery shelled her quarters, taking on very public roles, both on behalf of her husband and in a campaign to help the common soldiers of the Continental Army. In the process, she won the heart of a nation. She was honored by great and small. After her arrival in Cambridge that first year, she wrote in some mystification about her reception on her way home. After stopping in Philadelphia along the way, she noted that when she resumed her journey, she left the city in as great pomp as if I had been a very great somebody. Excuse me. Children were named for her even very early in the war. In 1789, for example, the Washingtons were sent a portrait of a set of twins who had been born in 1775 and had the honor of bearing the names of Your Excellency and Lady. So they were named George and Martha Washington. When Nathaniel Green's When Nathaniel Greene's wife wrote in the spring of 1777 to let her husband know that she had given birth to a little girl, he replied that I am happy to hear you have such a fine daughter. Mrs. Washington's Christian name is Martha. I shall have no objection to that or any other name you think proper to give her. Not just children, but at least 3 ships were named for the American commander's wife as well. A schooner called Lady Washington was commissioned as a privateer by the Massachusetts Council in the spring of 1776. Operating in New York waters that year was a galley of the same name, while a brig in Virginia that summer and fall was also known as the Lady Washington. There were at least 2 pieces of music written in Martha Washington's honor during the Revolution. The first, known variously as Lady Washington's Reel or Lady Washington's Quick Step in 1777. The second was Saw You My Hero George or Lady Washington 2 years later. All of these instances, together with gifts presented to her during the war and the fact that artists were providing clients with portraits of her, along with those of her husband, suggest the love and respect which she inspired in her countrymen from very early in the war. Some idea of the toughening effect the war had on Martha Washington's character can be seen in a statement made by her grandson many years after her death. George Washington Parke Custis recalled that his grandmother often remarked that it had been her fortune to hear the first cannon at the opening and the last at the closing of all the campaigns of the Revolutionary War. Quite a change from the frightened little person who tried so hard not to let on how afraid she was that first winter in Cambridge. It wasn't just to her family that Martha Washington talked about the war. A visitor to Mount Vernon in 1785 remarked, "It's astonishing with what raptures Mrs. Washington spoke about the discipline of the army, the excellent order they were in, superior to any troop she said upon the face of the earth towards the close of the war. What pleasure she took in the sound of the fifes and drums, preferring it to any music that was ever heard, and then to see them reviewed a week or 2 before the men disbanded, when they were all well clothed, was, she said, a most heavenly sight." And yet, there were other aspects of her personality that would never change. The woman who wrote of her astonishment at the ceremonious greetings given to her during the war, as if I'd been a very great somebody, would never really lose her sense of who she was. Not long before George Washington died, Thomas Jefferson, who was then estranged from the Washingtons because of political differences, told a young visitor to Monticello that he found it singular that Mrs. Washington was incapable of being injured by flattery, for she received more of it than ever any woman had before, but it did not affect her. I attribute this to the goodness of her heart. No woman could be more idolized or have more incense paid to her than she had. Yet she had not the least degree of pride or affectation. Others, less hostile, found her extremely kind and unaffected, with no affectation of superiority in the slightest degree. Her successor as First Lady, Abigail Adams, would say that her manners are modest and unassuming, dignified and feminine. In another letter, Mrs. Adams said that Mrs. Washington is one of those unassuming characters which create love and esteem. A most becoming pleasantness sits upon her countenance, and an unaffected deportment which renders her the object of veneration and respect. Martha Washington herself wrote to her old wartime friend, Mercy Otis Warren, in the first year of her husband's presidency, that she had not initially wanted him to take on that great responsibility, and that her new life in the executive mansion was not one she would have chosen for herself. In this long and unusually reflective letter, she went on to say, "With respect to myself, I had much rather be at home. I have too much of the vanity of human affairs to expect felicity from the splendid scenes of public life. I am still determined to be cheerful and to be happy in whatever situation I may be, for I have also learnt from experience that the greater part of our happiness or misery depends upon our dispositions and not upon our circumstances. We carry the needs of the one or the other about with us in our minds wherever we go." It could very well have been this quality of knowing herself together with the loyalty she showed to her husband, the Continental Army, and the American cause itself through 8 years of war, and the strength she exhibited in overcoming her fears that made the country open their hearts to her as their first lady, both during the war and 6 years later during the presidency.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. Beautifully stated. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm trying to get rid of this. It's gone.
I'm glad. So, I think if everybody can hang on, it's 7:54 now, but if we have a few questions that are in the chat, Mary.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
okay, so here's what the first question. Is there any evidence that the British targeted Martha Washington for kidnapping or ransom? And if not, was this due a honorable, in quote, award, not to families of either American or British officers?
Um, well, I talked a little bit about how at the beginning of the war, the people in Alexandria and other people in Virginia were worried that the British were going to try to capture Martha Washington. Um, that didn't happen. George Washington doubted that it would, but he was making arrangements with people that she would maybe have a place to stay in Alexandria if it looked like the British were going to hit Mount Vernon. Um, so people were definitely thinking about it. There's just no evidence that that ever happened.
Okay, thanks. Well, now here's the next question. Could you speculate on the relationship Martha might have had with Mrs. Ford during her stay at the Ford home, 1779 to 1780?
I haven't, that's one of the headquarters that I have not been able to find, or much, have not been able to find much about Martha's time in that house. So I can't really answer.
Okay, thank you. Now, here's another one. When Martha visited George during the winter camps, did she bring any of her children? And he states, I may be mistaken, but were most of the letters between Martha and George destroyed?
Um, yeah, so her son, there was usually a family member. Sometimes it was Lund Washington, sometimes it might be a nephew, who would go up with her and sometimes stay for a while or perhaps turn around and go back home. It just depended on what was going on in everybody's lives at the time. Um, Martha's daughter died in 1774, I believe. Um, and her son, um, John Park Custis, we know he and his young bride went, I think, up to Cambridge and spent the winter at the house that it was later the Longfellow house in Cambridge. So John Park Custis went up then. He may have gone up with her another time. Um, and then let's see what happened. Um, he- the only time in the war, he managed to stay out of the war completely. And when his stepfather and the French generals stopped at Mount Vernon for a few days on their way down to Yorktown for the final, battle of the war. Um, he went with them. And so that was the first time that he was ever in a more, um, not just looking after mom, but um, had maybe some military duties. He did not, as far as I know, join the army, but he may have had things to do around the office. And he got sick with camp fever. And so one of those diseases that was making the rounds in the army and died at a relative's home near Yorktown, and he was buried down there, um, which pretty much crushed Martha.
Thanks, Mary. I have one question. How common was it for officers' wives to go to the camps? And what are the living conditions? I mean, they're not living in the tents, right? I mean, there's homes that have been taken over or used or
Mhm.
borrowed and
Requisitioned.
acquisitioned, yes. And uh, she would have had enslaved people with her to serve her. I mean, she's living in fairly good conditions.
She's living in pretty good conditions, right? With GW being the commander in chief and having to deal with foreign diplomats, members of Congress, and all kinds of officials um, coming to see him and stay. Um, it was more like in some ways, more like a private house with a whole bunch of people doing paperwork. Um, um, yeah.
So, so good, thank you. So where we have women following their husbands or joining their husbands and cooking and doing laundry and having some kind of way of living there. Maybe they don't even have a home anymore. Um,
Mhm.
then the officers' wives would have attended them as well, but in better living conditions.
Right. Mhm. So, um, Nathaniel Green's wife came to camp. Um, who else came? A number of the general officers' wives came. So they all knew each other. Um,
Interesting. And, I was kind of struck by how Martha Washington and Ben Franklin's daughter
mhm,
organized their charity drive.
mhm,
It kind of reminds me of what Pamela Ann Cunningham did to
mhm,
start the Ladies Association with someone from each state,
mhm.
representatives. Was she aware of this and did it that way, or?
I don't know if she was, but they may well have remembered. Um,
I think that's astounding and fascinating.
mhm.
Thank you so much, Mary. Well, it's just 8:01, and so thank everybody for joining us. Peggy, if you could put our last slide on, I do want to invite everybody to come to our next behind the scenes, which will just be just in a week and a half on March 9th. Ken Bancroft will be offering a different perspective. We've had two perspectives on women in the revolution, and now we're going to, who are patriots, and now we're going to look at a loyalist, an English Tory in Old Town. Ken Bancroft has gone through the journals of Nicholas Creswell to identify his views and thoughts and the way he was treated in Alexandria. This is amazing opportunity. Ken contacted us. He lives in Loudoun County. He's doing this as a personal joy to pull all of this together. And we're delighted that he told us of his efforts so that we can invite him. And hopefully his work will also be put into our publication, The Chronicle, but it will also be recorded. So you can register for that now through the alexandriahistoricalsociety.org. And please remember also our Lyceum lecture, the first of this season, March 25th, a Wednesday. And for Women's History Month, we'll be having Amanda Roper talk about Savings Americans Past and Women in Preservation, which is a perfect um, conclusion to Martha Washington's efforts and Pamela Ann Cunningham and starting Saving Mount Vernon. and the rest of women in preservation. And Mary, thank you as a woman, lots of preserving memories and sharing them in all of your books. We look forward to your next book on animals and maybe more on Mary. So thank you all. We had 40 participants tonight, and thank you, Peggy, for controlling all the Zoom. And thanks for the good questions. Thank you, Mary, and everybody. We really appreciate what you're doing. Thank you. Good night, everyone.